What if recommendation by the worst channel you have ever seen, and it's gonna be what if Caesar survived. So basically the way that this works is that during Caesar's fight with Wamu, he just doesn't end up getting crushed by that part of the ceiling. And because of this, he survives. So how does he not get crushed? Well, he might just dodge, or he could have defeated Wamu in their fight using the sun, with his Hamon abilities, with his bubbles to kind of reflect onto Wamu and defeat him that way, or something like that. Or he may have just been thrown out the building in some way, which led to him surviving because he didn't end up getting crushed by the ceiling. So he either defeats Wamu at that point and survives, or he just survives and they end up defeating Wamu at the regular time that they did in canon. Just Caesar is there to help Joseph in this case. And then we get on to the fight with Cars, where it's likely that they would be able to defeat Cars in like reality, killing him basically instead of just sending him to space, because they'd be able to stop him from becoming the ultimate life form and stop him from even getting the Red Stone of Asia. And that is because with the help of Caesar they just be able to stop him from getting in the first place. Either they could have Caesar holding on to it or something like that, or there's a multitude of different ways that they could do this, but basically Caesar being there helps them in defeating Cars. They stop him from becoming the ultimate life form. They can kill him, and this means that Joseph probably doesn't get his hand chopped off, right? And so he doesn't need to go to Suzy-Q to get help. So they might not end up bonding like that, and they might not even end up getting married. And if they don't get together, then there's no Holly, and if there's no Holly, no Jotaro, and no Jotaro means no Jolene. So that has some pretty big ripple effects throughout the story. And let's start it out with part 3, where we get to see some of those changes. And given that Joseph and Caesar are around the same age, I would assume that Caesar would probably have kids or grandkids by the point of part 3 who are around the same age that Jotaro would have been in canon, and they'd probably join the Stardust Crusaders against Dio. And in this case, if Jotaro and Holly aren't around, then we could have the main reason for the Stardust Crusaders even going after Dio, rather than being Holly dying, is young Josuke dying. And that would be because if there's no relationship with Suzy-Q, then Joseph would likely have stayed with Tomoko when he met her. He would just live with Tomoko and Josuke. Because I'm pretty sure if Joseph knew that Josuke existed, then he would have ended up staying with them or at least helping in some way. So, I mean, in this case, there's no other. His wife's not there, so he could just marry Tomoko, and they'd live together, and he could raise Joseph. Well, Joseph, I mean, could raise Josuke as Josuke Joestar in this scenario, because he's actually raised by his father Joseph, and that would be really different for Josuke's story, and it would be pretty interesting to see that whole new scenario where Josuke is now the factor that leads them to going after Dio instead of Holly. And yeah, so we basically just substitute Jotaro in the Stardust Crusaders with Caesar and his grandkids, probably one like his kids or grandkids, and then one of those grandkids is most likely gonna end up getting together with Kakyoin. So one of those grandkids is a girl who gets with Kakyoin and ends up having a kid with him. And that character could substitute Jolene as being the main character for part 6 once we get to that, because Jolene doesn't exist in this timeline. And so, going back to part 3, I feel like Joseph, now that Caesar's alive, would most likely have continued his Hamon training, and so he'd still be young, which would also help with the whole raising Josuke scenario. But yeah, anyways, um, we could have the Joseph young Joseph now. Well, he's like young Joseph, even though he's old, because he's got the. He appears like young Joseph. You know what I mean? Because of the hormone. And Caesar training the rest of the Stardust Crusaders in this version of the story how to use hormone. And if they do, then that would help out with pretty much all of the fights because they'd just be able to defeat everyone more easily and quickly than in canon. And once we get to fights like against Young Darby and stuff, they aren't able to take anyone away, and they can just defeat him more easily and quickly. And especially against the fight with Vanilla Ice, because he's a vampire. And most likely, this would mean that Abdul and Iggy don't die. And if they don't die against Vanilla Ice, then that means that Polnareff doesn't just rush into battle with Dio. And if he doesn't do that, then Kakyoin probably does not end up being killed by Dio. He does. He just survives then, and that also helps with what I was talking about just a bit ago with him getting together with one of Caesar's kids or grandkids, probably grandkids. Um, and so yeah, that's some ripple effects of Caesar surviving from parts 2 to 3, and they still end up defeating Dio in the end. Just everybody survives most likely. Dio might end up killing Joseph in the fight, which would be interesting because then you would have Joseph dying, but he has a connection with Josuke because he would actually have been raising him for during his youth. But and then you could have the scenario where Kakyoin has to step in as that father figure for Josuke because he's also Japanese, and that would be interesting. Or in another scenario where it's closer to canon, where Jotaro and everybody on that side of their family still exists, then Josuke would just never have ended up meeting his father in the first place. So either way, that's the ending of part 3. They still defeat Dio, and yeah, in this scenario, we can have everyone surviving, and or with Joseph surviving as well. And now when we get to part 4, if Joseph survived part 3, then he can be around with Josuke, and that would also mean that Shizuka probably wouldn't have ended up getting saved if Joseph was dead in this version of the story. But if he was alive, then he would probably still like rescue her essentially, and he'd become like her adopted father basically, and he'd be able to do more because he'd still be in a younger, more able state because of Hamon, and that would be interesting. So we could have her also feature more in part 6 potentially as like a friend of Kakyoin and Caesar's kid's child basically, if you know what I mean. So yeah, that could be an interesting way that we link all of these different changes that would just come from Caesar surviving in part 2. And also, now we go on to the ending of part 4, which is without Star Platinum, the world, are they even really going to be able to survive against Kira? Because from what I recall, even though I haven't seen part 4 in a long time, Star Platinum's time stop ability played a pretty vital role, quite a vital role, in the crew of Part 4 even surviving or even defeating Kira in that scenario. So without him there, would another character have Star Platinum, or would no one have Star Platinum? Maybe Joseph would have Star Platinum instead of Hermit Purple, or he'd still just have Hermit Purple, and another character like Josuke might have Star Platinum instead of Crazy Diamond. That would be an interesting thing. Or um, they have. I mean, who else could have had Star Platinum in this scenario? Would it be Kakyoin? I don't know. But yeah, it would have to assume it. I assume be Joseph if Jotaro doesn't exist in that form in that timeline. So that would cause some issues when defeating Dio, as mentioned earlier. But I think they'd probably still be able to get through it eventually with all the extra added power and extra Hamon users and stuff. They would be able to find a way. most likely even without Star Platinum. But if they did have Star Platinum through Joseph or another member like Josuke, but Josuke wouldn't be there in part 3, so maybe Kakyoin or somebody, they'd probably still be able to defeat Dio in part 3. Or they'd all just get defeated by Dio and they'd all die in part 3 without Star Platinum. So there's a few different ways you can look at that. But if they do end up defeating Star Platinum or defeating the world, defeating Dio, and they do survive till part 4, everybody survives. Then we could have Joseph raising Josuke, continue to raise him, then they could fight together against Kira, and somehow they still defeat Kira even without the help of Star Platinum, or with the help of Star Platinum through a different character. Um, and yeah, they defeat Kira. Or they also all just get defeated by Kira if they don't have Star Platinum or they don't have a similar advantage that they could have gotten from that stand. So yeah, somehow, some way, those are a few scenarios that come from this. And now we get to part 5, which is mostly the same for at least a majority of that part. Unless if Jotaro is not there, then would Polnareff have even been sent to deal with Diavolo at the start, before part 5 even started, and have been crippled and everything like that? Maybe so, because it was kind of connected with the Speedwagon Foundation potentially, so he could have still gone and then he would still be present in part 5. But if it's not, then he might not have even been there to begin with, so he wouldn't have been there before, he wouldn't have been attacked by Diablo, and if he hadn't been, then if he was still there during the part of part 5 where he is canonically in the Colosseum, then would he even have been able to help that much? Maybe yes, maybe no. Uh, let's say yes, and if he is, then things would mostly go similar to canon. If he wasn't, then the team would probably lose. The Part 5 team would probably lose in that scenario. But if they do win, Bruno still probably dies because he was like a walking corpse at that point. Abakio probably dies as well still because he died earlier on in that part. And Polnareff, if he's there, he probably survives. He doesn't get turned into a turtle. And Narancha probably also survives. So those are some um, different scenarios with that part as well. So if they do survive, then Narancha and Polnareff and Giorno, of course, probably survive. But if they don't, then everybody dies. So yeah, and now we get to part 6, which has, well, it would most likely be the ending of this version, this timeline of JoJo's, because in the case where Jolene isn't there, they would have Kakyoin's kid as well as Shizuka um, in the prison dealing with Pucci. And if they're doing that, well, it would be somewhat, at least a decent amount different from canon. And Pucci, if he still does end up getting defeated, most likely Weather still dies at the same time that he does in canon, and so does Hermes, I would assume, as well. Although Anasui and FF probably survive. And if they do survive, then if all of those, if they survive as well as Shizuka and Kakyoin's kid, then they may still be able to defeat Pucci. And if they do defeat Pucci, then there's no universe reset, and then that's just the end. It ends with part 6, happy ending. Or we have the bad ending where Pucci wins and he just kills everybody and he resets the universe. And either way, that would just be the end of the series at that point. So we can see how Caesar surviving in part 2 causes massive ripple effects for the whole rest of JoJo's. And yeah, so that's just a few ideas thrown out there and by me. And so really cool what if recommendation again by the worst channel you have ever seen. Thanks again for the idea, and thanks for listening, everybody. And yeah, bye, guys.